All right, folks. All right. I see we're recording. We're up and running. So let's get the show on the road. First off, just to let you know, on Tuesday, I will be back in the school and we will be back in the classroom, and I'll see how long I can go with my leg. Um, we are going to finish price today of the four P's. And then on Tuesday, we'll be talking about place, which is my home territory. And we will be doing our roll your own kind of stuff on place because that's one of my particular fields and specialties. So we won't be using much from the book. We'll be working off of my specialties. Okay. So, first off, everyone can hear me. We're all good. We're all okay. I'm getting a yes. Okay, that's cool. So, how about we get this bucket on the road and on the way? Before I go on, while I'm thinking about it, I wanted to share this anyway. So, we're going to be talking about in we'll be talking about chapters 2 and 3 in marketing strategy. And I was really interested. I have a YouTube video that will show later on, but Starbucks is having some real issues right now. Starbucks, in essence, has had four consecutive quarters of sales that have dropped. And I find it very interesting in the discussion. And when we talk about strategies, I'll expand this a little bit out. And one of the things that kind of putting all of these things together is when you think of Starbucks and when you think of corporations like this, the a Starbucks is more than just a cup of coffee. There are certain satisfactions that go into having a Starbucks. And the Starbucks is more than just the sum total of the coffee. It's also very much the ambiance and the experience that goes along with it. And Starbucks has suffered pretty badly over the last 2 or 3 years. And unsurprisingly, a lot of that has to do with COVID and a few business decisions that they made that, while they may have been correct in the sense at that point, they are in many ways suffering from those issues right now. So I just kind of wanted to show you this and kind of interesting. I've seen a couple of articles that kind of touch on it. One of my colleagues, I believe in Florida, has written on this as well. I'm always kind of fascinated on what makes Starbucks desirable. I mean, I am not a loyal customers. I mean, I'm a patron of it when I feel like it, but I am certainly not in Starbucks market segmentation. So I am out of this wheelhouse. But anyway, one of the things during the semester, especially when we're talking strategy, I want to talk real life situations. So get your mind thinking back and forth about how these particular things are created. Okay. All right. Let's kind of move ahead. So we are stepping in to the next section on price. So price is the easiest of all of the four P's to change. And yet the impact of price is so profound and so important that if you do not consider price in your considerations, you may have some very difficult problems. Will, are you having problems hearing me? I was noticing you're having to change your headsets. Is everything okay? Can everyone hear me, by the way? We're all good?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, I just wanted to check. Will, if you're missing some of this, we are recording this, so you'll be able to pick it up again, okay? Just checking. See things happening and I want to try to help out. So, why is a strategy important in price? Because quite simply, it is so easy to change and yet so valuable to the success and yet can directly lead to the failure of a corporation if the price is not set correctly. It is an easily changeable marketing value variable, excuse me. It is that revenue, part of that revenue equation where the price times the quantity sold ultimately gives you how many units you sell. And so not only that, but we need to be able to um, research our competitors and their use of price. And it is a consideration when we are valuing ourselves against our competitors, where do we fit in? And because it is the only real means of differentiation in a highly commoditized market, and I would even say that on certain things, where if you look at electronics, I would certainly say that prices have become major considerations because most of what we would consider the minimum standards for, say, purchasing a cell phone or a high definition television are significant. It requires us perhaps to spin off into other considerations when we're buying something. Now, if you're looking at the lower end of the high definition or the the 4K televisions, you're looking at TCL and many of the others. But then there are other ones like Samsung and LG that have QLED and OLED that have to find ways to break out from the commodity trap. Um, However, you might be in a particular industry in which many times you're considered the same. It doesn't mean you always have to shoot for the lowest price in order to sell, but it means that you have to think about it in order to be able to manage highly commoditized markets and to achieve some kind of success. Okay. I do not want you to worry about what break even means in selling prices. I'm sure you're going to get into finance and accounting at some point. Yes, those are valued and important for us, but we're marketers, all right? We look at something that is even more important to us, and that is the consideration of value. So, way back when, and I think I've said this before in our first class or two, um, we always considered consumer satisfaction to be the number one goal. Um, we even had satisfaction as part as the definition of what marketing was in the AMA journals. However, we've gone far past that. So, who has gone into Walmart? Well, if you have been able to go into Walmart, this one, by the way, but going into the Walmart and going, man, I'm really satisfied. I had a really good time in the Walmart. Gosh, it was great. I want to go back again. I mean, we we cringe at that experience sometimes. And yet we go again and again and again. And sometimes perhaps what we have to consider is that satisfaction isn't the important thing, is value. And I think very much so, Walmart lives and breathes on the concept of what value is. And so, what is value? Value is the consumer's subjective evaluation of all benefits relative to all costs. Now, way back in 1986, and I think I've said this again, Thaler, who was an economist, thought that you could calculate all of the utility that a particular good brought and ultimately come up with what they would consider to be a fair and balanced price on everything. Well, the problem with Thaler's concepts is that you could put a number on anything. And the truth is that I can't explain many ways why I consider something valuable. I only know that I do. And it's that subjective evaluation of the benefits many times are the things that carry us beyond whatever the cost is. And so we try to hopefully understand value because it helps to determine the worth of the firm's offerings relative to other product offerings. In marketing strategy, we're always thinking of our competitors. Thank God for our competitors. They make us stronger. We want to know everything about them. We want to know and understand what their particular benefits are so we can create some unique value that's different from them. Realize this is that value is tied to everything in a marketing program. It's tied to the four P's. It's tied to how we exist out in the industry. Our ability to deliver value is tied to all of those elements, each thing, and it is a key factor for customer satisfaction and retention. If you noticed, value comes first, and once we have value, then we can have a customer satisfaction. Kind of an interesting thing, by the way. Excuse me, I got to get some coffee. Um, One of the interesting things, Walmart between 2017 and 2019, Walmart's customer satisfaction went from 71% to 82%. In other words, 82% of all consumers that have gone into Walmart have become more satisfied. Well, part of that is the value scenario, but there is another thing that's tied it into it as well. Between the years of 2017 and 2019, Walmart gave all 2.5 million employees a pay raise. And when the employee satisfaction went up, there was a greater satisfaction with their jobs, and it naturally reflected into the customers. So isn't that funny? You know, it makes you feel better to have that, and that ultimately relates to how it brought more value to the consumer experience. And so the key issue in the pricing strategy is how the consumers perceive its value. And so, what are those things we talked about? It is the benefits that the consumer has, everything that the positive parts aspects that are coming up with that offering, and then the consumer costs are everything that the consumer must give up. Now, it's also important to understand that there doesn't have to be monetary concerns because that's also what value is about. What about the hours that you have to give up in order to be able to obtain something? What if you have to work months to be able to obtain the cost to be able to buy those particular things? Those are all considerations that come into making up the consumer costs. Well, what are the benefits? Can anyone tell me what is the benefit between buying a minivan, which I'm sure all of you want to do when you graduate, versus buying pretty cool SUV? We all understand it. The fear is that any of our friends see us in a minivan, we're in trouble. All right, that is a both benefit side and the cost side. Risk follows in a lot of them, and one of them is when you're right out. By the way, when you're right out of school, I think the number is one third to one half of every within the first 2 years you go buy a new automobile. Congratulations. I get it. I know I did the same thing. Um, the benefits also is are a perceived upping in your particular social score. Let's put it that way. And so these are all parts of the mix of how we go about perceiving value. We can be given something, and the giving of that item doesn't mean anything to us at all. My father, God bless his soul, when my niece when she was 17, she's 38 now, but when she was 17 years old, gave her a minivan to drive. And think of a 17-year-old girl with a minivan. He didn't get it, all right? And so he was miffed when they took the van and bought something smaller, but it just didn't have any value, even if it was free. And so I'm just giving you an idea of how all of these things relate together. And so the problems also are is there's a lot of myths about price. For one of them is that when the business is good, a price cut will capture more of the market. Maybe. Not necessarily. In an ever expanding market, you may not have a greater market share because your amount is expanding with the whole size of the market. So that might be wrong. And another is that when business is bad, a price cut will stimulate sales. Wrong. In the mid 90s, 2000s, there was something of a slump in the music industry, and it was caused by the movement to compact disc. Now, interesting enough, when I was in the 60s and 70s, when I was growing up, one of the things that we could do was we could buy one record. In other words, one single song. Um, this was in the days on radio, you had what was known as the top 40. So the top 40 individual singles, 45s that you would buy was how you knew what was the number one or number two, whatever songs, all the way to the top 40. And top 40 was cool because it didn't matter what genre. It could be classic, it could be country, it could be pop, it could be bubblegum, it could be all of those things. And whatever the tops were, that's where you had the success. Well, the problem when compact disc came along was compact disc eliminated the single record, the 45s. And so there was a problem. How do we get to be able to get consumers back in the market? Well, the problem with this is there was no delivery system at that time for single records, but actually there was in the 70s. They started coming up with the concepts or the format for MP3. And then around in the 90s, there was this little corporation called Napster that was finding ways of being able to send things using digital recordings. So all of this was brewing at the same time. Well, the record industry said, hey, no problem. We'll just drop the price. It didn't change a thing. The number of CDs that were sold were consistent, but what happened is they reduced the overall revenues by something like 30 to 40%. So cost cutting is not the catch all be all. It should be offset by an increase of sales, but you've got to be able to maintain the revenue. And so what I'm basically saying is that price does more than simply generate revenue. It also generates a perception of the goods that you're selling. And so now that we think of price as more than just setting a particular value, or let's just say a dollar amount, what are some of the reasons that we will take when we're doing pricing? Well, one of the first of them is what's called profit oriented. And the profit oriented may be the most common because it's always measured against the competitors. And so what you're looking to do is find your particular piece of perceived value relative to the competition that also takes into account your cost and your production efficiencies. And so what you're balanced for or what you're hoping for is a specific targeted return rather than simply maximizing profits. Profit orientation is kind of looking in a long-term phase, saying, I'm not as good as Starbucks, but I'm not as bad as McDonald's. And so where do I find myself in that particular mix? And where profit orientation also does is it might find you inching slower and slower closer to the Starbucks line because you also want to be perceived as a premium brewer and you need to have a particular cost to be able to obtain that. That's prestige pricing as well. So they kind of work together. Volume oriented sets prices in order to maximize per unit or the dollar or per unit sales. And so what you do is you sacrifice profit margin to get a lot of products out there. Okay. So you want to be able to get as many of those as you possibly can. Texas Instruments has been making calculators actually since the 60s, but TI since the 70s, next to Hewlett Packard, has kind of dominated the market in pocket calculators. Yes, there is still such a thing. But one of the things that TI was able to do this over other corporations when there were a lot of calculators coming out is that they set a price to make sure that they always had the volume that they wanted. They were not particularly worried about whether they were going to get all the dollar amount they wanted. They just basically wanted to control that group. Okay. And so what they're hoping to do is spin enough TI calculators out there so that the cost of production is always going to be on their side. Market demand is basically known as charging whatever the market will bear. In other words, the consumer's expectations in certain buying situations means that they're going to expect to pay a certain price. And so what you want to be able to do is make as much money as you can in a given situation based upon what the customer would expect. If I'm going into a fine dining place like Bistro Roca and I'm spending money on a steak, I understand, where my expectation on that is. However, if I'm going in there for hors d'oeuvres, I'm expecting something else. And so market demand, charging what the market will bear is exactly that, whatever the market can handle as a price. Now, volume oriented and market share are somewhere in the same, but where market share is basically most considered on the mature side of a market when basically there are no other competitors out there. What happens is in the product life cycle, you lose many of the major players out there and you collapse down to a given small number, and there are no new individuals in there jumping in. And so, in order to be able to increase price, or let's just say increase demand, what you're trying to do is find that sweet spot to maintain 30 to 35% of the overall market. That would be what that means is. And so you try to maintain that particular section so that you can survive. And even if you're going to grow, your growth won't come from new sales. It'll come from taking off one of your competitors, some of their particular customer base. So Apple is famous for being able to use cash flow to their advantage. And cash flow means basically you want to recover as much cash as you possibly can, as quickly as you can. Sometimes this is for an emergency situation when you simply must get something in. But also, what Apple likes to do is when they come out with an initial product, their point is to generate revenues as quickly as they possibly can. Competitive matching is just exactly what it sounds like. And it's when you're one of the industry individual players that tends to be ranked not in the top one or two, but where you are is you want to be able to follow the leaders along and be able to remain viable. And so what you do is you match or you try to beat your competitors' prices. And what you're trying to do is once again make the value of your good relative to the competition as well. And so saying I can beat or better anyone's price is a way of making sure that you're in that same group with your competition, providing value. So if any of you have ever walked in New York City, and you happen to have somebody who has these great Rolex watches for around $45, your first honest assessment is that it's a fake, and it's probably a good assessment. There are prices that are consistent with items that carry a certain prestige. Apple computers generally have a 35% profit margin, or excuse me, yes, relative to the competition, which has a profit margin around 5 or 6. Those prices are based upon the value that the consumers see in that particular item. Rolex watches. We're also looking at those things because they represent the finest of what that particular industry has to offer. It's amazing to see how the thought of prestige moves back and forth between goods, because it can vanish in a second. And then the last is a status quo. And usually these are organizations that are struggling and they're needing some way to be able to remain consistent. And so what they just hope to do is be able to sustain where they are relative to the competition. And they're able to go ahead and consistently survive, if not excel. Well, given those things and we change the prices, sometimes we might change the prices and a lot happens. And then there's also times when we change prices where nothing happens at all. And so there's a concept known as price elasticity. And this is the customer's sensitivity to changes in price and how it affects and changes demand. And so the definitions are: an item price is elastic when a relatively small change in price affects a relatively larger change in demand. And so that is when an item, the price is elastic. A price is inelastic when it is considered a significant change in price brings a not so significant change in demand. What is the impact on the demand of the product? Increases and decreases charged for the product is given, and how dramatic are those changes? So here are the things that increase elasticity. Is there an available substitute for that particular product? So for many, interestingly enough, soft drinks back in the 30s and 40s, Cokes came in a 6-ounce, 6.5-ounce bottle. They were able to maintain quite a well because there was considered to be not a dramatic, let's just say there are not very many dramatic differences in other colas. RC Cola, I believe it's from North Carolina, came out with the first 12-ounce bottle. Now, the interesting thing about it is that 12-ounce bottle really knocked the legs out from under Coke because it didn't know how to respond, because people were buying it more, because not only did they consider RC Cola to be a sufficient substitute, but once again, the change in volume meant that they were expecting greater value. And so the availability of substitute products makes a big difference in price elasticity. Not only that, but we have competitors that may be generic in type that are not direct ones. So an example would be if the price of a Coke was simply too high, I would just drink water instead. That would be an example. The next is what is the total expenditure relative to your overall budget? And so I can't think of anything more than what housing has done in the last 5 years, is that what has made the ability to afford a home now is that the total expenditure of our incomes into housing is almost absurd. So for those of you who have not shopped for a house yet and who may eventually will, one of the things that they look at, or one of those benchmarks is that housing should be no more than 36% of your overall budget. And so the difficulty with housing now is that it's in the 50 and 60 ranges. And so if any item starts to take a dramatic amount of your particular overall budget, you have a tendency to have greater price elasticity. Not only that, but if there are notable differences in prices, substantial enough, and what is a substantial difference? Well, it all depends on the consumer. The consumer always has a price inside themselves that they consider a particular item should hit. And so if I were to say the cost of a truck Many of you already have your suggested retail prices in your head. Given up and down those particular ranges, if there are substantial differences, you'll notice them and you may consider choosing another truck versus another. Now, I've read some interesting things. I've seen some trucks by Toyota that they're looking at that have base prices of around 12 to $15,000, which I think is great. The difficulty is that large trucks help corporations meet cafe standards because they are exempt from the standards of a standard automobile. So whether or not you're going to see any changes in there, I don't know. And then finally, is it just easy to make a comparison? If you go to an Aldi, Aldi is 75 to 80% of store brands, and occasionally they'll have their other things. If you go in an Aldi store and look at their store brands versus the regular industry brands, it's substantial enough for people to just simply say, I'll be happy to use that as well. And so these are the things that make price elastic. Well, what makes prices inelastic? Okay. These are the things that lower elasticity. I mean, who has a substitute for gasoline? Not sure I know of any. Um, that is a big issue. I can't simply say I'll put something different in my gas tank. I must be able to use that in order to go places. So the lack of substitutes may force you to use less of that, but it doesn't make you change it. Well, what if there's a real or perceived necessity that this particular thing is very important and without it, I, I can't do without it. Necessities and product benefits are kind of consistent with each other. It's what we perceive them to bring me different from another thing. So one of my miracle drugs is Alka-Seltzer. All right. Alka-Seltzer, I very much use because it has certain advantages that I perceive. Like one of them is it is a liquid form and is absorbed into the stomach wall within 30 seconds, which for me is great. All right. The those advantages are such and the product benefits are so good that it makes me perceive them as being better no matter what. Complementary products, if I've got to be able to use one thing in order to use another, then I've got to, I in essence have to use those things because I have to use something else. And so, once again, in terms of complementary products, we can talk about gasoline and automobiles, or I can talk about cell phones and cell phone services. That also comes under price bundling. But the items that you need somewhere else, you need this other product in order to be able to achieve that would be a complementary product. So we talked about perceived benefits, situational influences, especially in times of emergencies, reduce our desire to have to go shopping for one other thing. Time poverty is a great issue of the modern world, which means that we have less and less time to make choices, to make rational decisions. This is an example of a situational influence. Something is occurring at that moment in time that makes us change our willingness to buy something, or let me just quite simply say, our inability to avoid buying it. And so that would be an example. And then Friday, do we perceive those items as being different? Um, if they are demonstratively different, then in terms of our inelastic nature, we will buy that one particular thing regardless of any cost. And so, is that item different? If we perceive it is, then we tend to be inelastic with prices. We don't perceive or we don't accept that there is a substitute for what we're originally buying. So, how do we price a service? Um, Many times, service costs will be standardized within a corporation, um, because of this uncertainty. The ability for the service individual to be able to charge whatever they wish requires there to be some kind of structure. It sometimes is the only cue to quality as well. In our natural perception is that when we go into a place where the price is higher, then we perceive to have a higher benefit. So the price at Sports Clip is significantly less than the price where I go get my haircut somewhere else. I perceive the differences in there to be worth me paying more. And so why? Because the quality I perceive from that I get from the service is more. Service quality is hard to detect with a prior purchase. This is why consumers very much desire reviews from individuals who have already had that particular experience. It's very difficult to determine service costs because it can be something very simple or it could be something very complex. And customers are just kind of unfamiliar with how the service process works. Interestingly enough, that customer or the costs are difficult to determine. I had a work on a payroll system in Capital, Louisiana, and it was 3 o'clock, and they were desperate to put out the pay. And they asked me to drive from Lafayette. It took an hour and a half to get there. And when I got there, it was something that I actually fixed in 2 minutes. It wasn't that hard at all. How do I determine the cost of what to charge him? My standard rate at that time was $50 an hour, but did I do $50 worth of work? No. But that is why sometimes we standardize costs because the overall cost to do that, I could have really been deep in working there for hours if I didn't find it that early. So it's very hard sometimes to determine costs. It can also be difficult when brands aren't well established and you don't have a long-term kinds of interaction with them. It's hard to perceive that. Um, if I can do something myself, if I can perform a service, then my pricing that I expect from someone else might be a little bit different. But I'll be honest with you, the work that I have performed on myself, sometimes I think that the amount of time to fix something is not as valuable to me as someone who can fix it and have it done, and then it is guaranteed. Uh, it's also difficult to advertise within the service categories because how do you advertise your services in some way that is superior? And once again, what is the total price of service? Um, how long do you invest? It's hard to price service, and what usually happens is you price them along industry standards. But remember this, as I said before, um, price may be the only cue to quality prior to service, and you get big cues of quality depending on what the service price is. We're not going to worry about service pricing and yield management, so you can simply ignore that. And we're going to pass right by that. And we're going to talk about basic pricing strategies. So, what is the markup that we're going to put on our costs? As an average rule of thumb, in most retail environments, usually what you do is you double the cost, and that gives you ultimately what your price is going to be. They call that a markup, and the markup is 50%. So you just double the price. Okay. Well, that does not go about help you achieving marketing goals. And so there are other ways or reasons that you price that help you to achieve success. Excuse me. And so the first is price skimming. And so with price skimming, this is the all the traffic will bear, where you're basically trying to get as much money as you possibly can out of this particular market offering. You usually find that in the beginning of the profits of the product life cycle. So when the first smartphones came along, there was really no price base that consumers had in order to measure between what smartphones could be. So you could charge anything. However, once the market matures, you have consumers who have comparison pricing and it doesn't work. Price penetration basically says, I'm going to get there and sell as many units as I possibly can. Usually, price penetration happens during the growth cycle of the product life cycle when the overall pie is expanding at the same time. And what your focus is to get in there and get as many sales as you possibly can because you're looking at the other side of the balance sheet and where you're hoping to reduce the cost per unit as a way for you to be able to achieve success. So we talked about prestige pricing, that higher prices signal greater value. And for certain things, absolutely, prestige pricing is the only way to go. Luxury watches, jewelry is one of those as well. Especially those are items where the perceived value is within ourselves. And so prestige pricing is finding that market share that thinks your item is the best in the world and there is no substitute. And that's what prestige pricing is. So way back in the 80s and 90s, Walmart was known for doing their knockoff prices situations where they were going through and every commercial they ever had to do was $29.95 now 27.96 or whatever like that. It was a long drawn out process. In between 93 and 94, Walmart started to change their model, or less, and they reinvested much more work in being able to be efficient at the channels of distribution. So what it meant was is that instead of having gigantic shipments being slowly filtered out, they were practicing just in time and getting the goods just as they needed and sent everywhere that they were possibly needed. They decided to do what was called the dynamic pricing, or what we call everyday low price, EDLP. The value is calculated on basically first in, or let's just say last in, first out. In other words, whatever the last price is of the goods coming in, that number would be recalculated over and over again. It's one of the reasons why, Walmart has become very efficient at being able to change prices. In a dynamic pricing model, they're the ones who started this whole concept. EDLP would not be here unless Walmart came up with these great ideas. A real success in supply chain beyond anything. They were the first corporation to perceive that you could move your goods across the United States without a dry shipment. And what a dry shipment means is that you never have a truck rolling across the United States unless it's delivering something to somewhere. There's a lot of dead space that's being moved on trucking across the US, especially when it's less than a load kind of situations. But Walmart has a computer system that can help them figure out how to do it right. So all kudos to Walmart. Sorry, I'm going on. The last is just to match your competitors to make sure that you're in that same a segue and you're slightly different. And usually when you're competitive pricing and you're matching, you're going to do a couple of pennies higher than your competitor if you can get away with it. As long as you don't have a massive gap between you and the competitors and you find a sweet spot and you're making money, everything's fine. So we won't worry about non-price strategies. And we're going to only talk about a couple of these. And this is once we come up with the base price, how do we adjust it? So many of us like to be able to come out or starting with a given cost and then discounting that cost. Consumers perceive that as having value when the price moves from a larger price to another one. And so, especially in the furniture industry where prices are subject to negotiation, you'll have a couch that may be perhaps $800 and you'll say 40% off now and you get a new price. That would be an example. Discounting means that you start with a price. Reference pricing is the same thing, is that you established a baseline and then you slide up or down whatever that reference price is. Um, Automobile industry. The automobile industry is a not a business unit franchise, but a company name franchise. So modern Toyota, modern Subaru are basically independent corporations, and they buy or have contracts to buy from Subaru, from Toyota, and they have the right to be a representative of those companies. They have a right to fix their cars, but they are two completely separate entities. And that's kind of an important thing to understand. So when Toyota sends a bunch of Outbacks or whatever you want to think down a modern Toyota, excuse me, modern to gosh, listen to me. Toyotas. All right, let's just go there. Um, they have a reference price for each one of those automobiles, but the individual retailer takes title and physical possession. And because the franchise dealer takes title and physical possession, they have the right to set prices. And so what it means is the reference price is one thing, but the regular price may be entirely in one direction or the other. It's kind of one of those holes that the automobile industry has. But what it also means is that when there's a particular vehicle with great demand, it allows the franchisers to set the prices and make the money off of. And so, long story going, reference pricing. I'm not going to worry about price lining, but odd pricing is exactly what it sounds like. Um, if I were to write 39.95, we read from left to right and we would read the three first. Odd pricing, in other words, instead of $40 is 39.95, the consumer perceives that an odd price has greater value than a rounded out price, or let's just say costs less. That would be a better way of putting it. Even though it's a nickel, the nickel is sufficient for consumers to see a greater value. Kind of one of the interesting things that Walmart has done is they broke this odd pricing model in a little bit because the EDLP is a perfectly precise calculation. So it doesn't round to 95. It might be 86 or 32 or whatever, but it is odd pricing, but it's stretched to its natural conclusion. And then finally, price bundling are just those two things that you can't do without each other, which as examples is cell phone and cell phone service. We can adjust the price on a cell phone to zero because for us, the overall bundle of the costs that you get committed to within the given number of years is based in the price bundle. So what that means is that a cell phone that probably has a list price of $1,000 can literally be given away if it comes with a 2-year contract. And so that's where price bundling is. You have two prices that you can manipulate and so that consumers will buy both of those products at the same time. And so this is adjusting the base price. We're not going to worry about business markets. You'll be getting those through your master's studies. And guess what? We hit the wall. We are not going to talk about marketing chain or supply chain strategies now. Which is marketing channels anyway. We have finished with price. And so I'm going to go ahead and have these online by the afternoon. And so we're done with today. On Tuesday, the 11th, I will see you in class, and I hope you all have a great weekend, okay? Oh, I see a question. I'm sorry. Um, okay, you're okay, Will? All right, cool. Okay, folks. Well, without further ado, I hope you all have a great weekend. Thank you.